Welcome to the Hospice Education Podcast, where we explore the heart of palliative and end-of-life care. I'm Susie Scullion, Practice Educator for St Helena Hospice. Today, we're discussing spiritual care, something that can get overlooked but is absolutely essential, particularly when providing true holistic care. What is it? Why does it matter? And how can we, as healthcare professionals, provide it in a way that's inclusive and compassionate? Whether you're a healthcare professional, a caregiver, or simply someone curious about how we can better support people at the end of life, this podcast is a space for reflection, learning, and honest conversation. We'll explore what spiritual care really looks like in practice, why it matters, and how it can bring comfort, dignity, and humanity when it's needed most. Today, we're joined by Tim Leeson, Spiritual Lead at St Helena Hospice. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Susie.
Thank
you for having me.
joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience in chaplaincy?
Yeah, sure. So I was actually a youth worker for 18 years before getting into chaplaincy. And I spent 8 years working for Chelmsford Cathedral as their youth worker. And in that time, we set up a project called Community Chaplaincy, where we offered a chaplaincy service to a number of different community projects, a local primary school, a local mental health hospital, and the Jay's Hospice, which was at the time a hospice for kind of younger people. And so that was really my kind of entry into the world of healthcare chaplaincy. I wasn't employed at that point as a healthcare chaplain. I was still doing that as the youth worker. And around the same time I was studying, I was doing my doctorate, and I ended up writing a lot about my experience of chaplaincy, particularly on the mental health ward, actually. And when I submitted my doctorate, I kind of felt like that's the route I want to go down. So I left that job and did a couple of other kind of youth work related jobs for a couple of years while I was looking to kind of find the next thing. And then COVID happened, so that kind of put a bit of a spanner in the works. But eventually I met the lead chaplain at Colchester Hospital, a lovely woman called Linda Peel, and got on really well with her. And when a job came up at the hospital, she asked whether I wanted to apply for it. So I did and got the job. And I was there for, I guess, maybe just under 2 years before this job came up at St Helena. And I applied for that really thinking I'm probably not going to get this because I don't have a huge amount of experience, leading a chaplaincy team or department. But to my surprise, I did get it. And so now here I am. So I'd say I've been employed as a chaplain for 5 years. But if you include the stuff I was doing for Chelmsford Cathedral before, it probably adds up to about 10 years of experience, all in all.
Yeah. So a wealth of experience then for us.
I think so. I hope so. Always more to learn, though, obviously.
Absolutely. So when we say spiritual care, what do we actually mean? Is it just about religion?
Well, so no, it's not just about religion. In fact, most of my work isn't religious because most of the people who I support aren't religious. So if you kind of go back in time, chaplaincy traditionally was done by a kind of a Christian priest, and it would be the kind of the role of the chaplain to support Christian patients by bringing them communion and saying last rite and that kind of thing. But obviously times have changed and chaplaincy has moved with those times. So most of our patients who come into the hospice aren't particularly religious. And actually the ones who are religious often have their own support network figured out. They're often people who need me the least because they've got their own priests, their own church, their own faith community who can support them. So really, I guess kind of chaplaincy in the 21st century, we talk about spiritual care as well as religious and pastoral care. And it's a place to explore the same kind of questions that religion might explore, but without necessarily coming up with the same answers that religion might come up with. So it's about, what's most important to you? Where do you find meaning? What's the purpose of all of this? How do we find happiness, hope, fulfillment, that kind of thing? And again, like I say, for most people, the answers to those questions aren't particularly religious these days. It can be, anything from conversations about family to legacy to, even for some people, it's just getting outside, connecting with nature, walking the dog, that kind of thing. But it's the space in which you can explore those deeper, meaningful questions, really.
Fabulous. So if you don't have a particular religion, why does spiritual care matter so much at the end of life?
Well, actually, that's a really good question, because a lot of people hear the word chaplain or spirituality lead and assume that I'm there to talk about religion. And lots of people will think that, because they're not religious, it's not really a service for them. And part of the challenge that I have, and that the volunteers who work with me have, is that we need to get past that preconception that people have about what chaplaincy is, get past the idea that this is just something for religious people. And particularly when people are faced with the end of life, whether that's their own illness or the illness of a loved one, or the mortality of a loved one, those kinds of questions about, like, what's it all for? What's the purpose of all of this? Who am I, now that I've got this illness, this diagnosis? One of the things that comes up all the time in my conversations with patients is people say, I used to be this, I used to be really independent, and I used to be a caregiver, and I used to, bake cakes for the brownies every Tuesday, whatever it is. And now that stuff's been taken from me, these things that were important to me. So who am I now? Now that people have to look after me rather than me doing the looking after. So those big existential questions are questions that everybody asks, whether or not they're religious.
Sure.
And like I say, some of the work that we need to do, and actually this is why at St Helena, my job title is spirituality lead rather than chaplain, because there's a preconception that chaplain is a religious word.
Absolutely.
Even though, that is what I am. I am a chaplain, but by calling it spirituality lead, it hopefully, we think, maybe makes it a little bit more inclusive.
Definitely.
Makes it a bit clearer that it's for everyone.
Yeah, no matter what faith you are,
Yeah,
people are able to come to you, or you're able to go to them.
exactly that. Yeah.
Fabulous. So how do we make sure spiritual care is inclusive for everyone, and people of all faiths and those with none?
Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? Because so I've got my own spiritual outlook on life, and each of the volunteers that work with me, they all have their own spiritual outlooks on life. And so we come with our own preconceptions. But one of the things that I say when I'm training the volunteers up, and this is just as true for me as it is for them, is that we are here to support everybody as they want to be supported. So I leave my spiritual worldview at the door when I go in to visit a patient. And they might have an outlook or a worldview that's completely the opposite to mine, very different to mine. And in that moment, what I think doesn't really matter, because I'm there to support them as they want to be supported. So I guess the answer to that question is that we're more about asking questions than about giving answers. It's never our role as chaplains or spiritual care volunteers. It's never our role to tell people what to think, where to find hope, what to believe. Our role is to ask the questions that allow people to think about that stuff for themselves, and maybe come up with answers that we disagree with. And that's fine. They're allowed to do that. Their answers are just as valid as ours. So it is more about asking questions and giving answers. And we do, we've got what we call the Oasis at St Helena, which used to be called the Multi-Faith Chapel. And we rebranded that a little while ago because, again, chapel has quite religious connotations. Multi-faith suggests it's just for people who have a religious faith. So now we've called it the Oasis, which is a kind of lovely, refreshing kind of sounding place, but doesn't have any particular religious baggage, so anyone can come and use it. And if you go into the Oasis, you'll see as you come in, there's a big bookshelf, and on the bookshelf, there's all sorts of different texts and resources from different religions and spiritual traditions, including humanism, including kind of atheistic spiritual traditions, that anybody, patients, staff, can take off the shelf and use if they find it helpful. I almost kind of want to say we've got something for everyone. There's thousands of religions in the world, and we don't, is the reality. We're doing our best to make sure all kind of major world religions are covered. But, at some point, I don't know, we'll have a Zoroastrian come and use the hospice. And at that point, I'll be like, oh no, we don't have any Zoroastrian sacred texts, whatever it is. But we're doing our best to make sure that everybody has something, but that it's there on the shelf for them to help themselves to, if they want to, rather than it being something that's kind of like that we're imposing on them. We're not telling anybody this is what you should believe.
Yeah.
But if somebody asks for Hindu scriptures, we've got those. We can help with
Fab.
that. Yeah, that's
and you know what? When I go into the Oasis, it's got such a calm vibe to it. And even if people just want to go and sit in there and do some self-reflection, I think it's a perfect space for that.
Well, I'm really glad. I'm glad that you feel that way, because that's exactly what I want it to be.
Yeah.
And not too long after I started here, we kind of redecorated the Oasis a little bit, got some new furniture and stuff. And when I was talking to the marketing team about what I wanted it to look like, the phrase I kept using was like, think Zen garden rather than church. Because what I don't want is for people to walk in and feel like, oh, it's a religious space, this isn't for me. You know, and some chapels, you know, when you go to hospitals, airports, whatever, they feel like churches, and they really feel like this is a space for religious people. Whereas I think the Oasis now doesn't feel that way. There's no religious art on the walls anymore. Like I say, there's stuff on the bookshelf that people can help themselves to, but it's an inclusive space. We've got our little music player that plays kind of chill music with a little salt lamp and, you know, all that kind of stuff that just, I hope gives it a nice atmosphere.
It really
that just
does.
feels peaceful.
Like, it really does.
I'm glad.
It's beautiful in there.
That's brilliant.
So do you think spiritual care is everyone's job, or it's just really for the chaplain or spiritual care team?
So everybody who works or volunteers at the hospice has a responsibility for spiritual care. And that's not, I'm not just talking about nurses, you know, that includes the catering staff, that includes the maintenance staff, you know, anybody who potentially will meet a patient at any point has a responsibility for their spiritual care. That doesn't mean that everybody needs to have a massive awareness of all the major world religions. That doesn't mean that people need to be comfortable praying with people, like anything like that. That you don't need to do. But actually the kind of essence of spiritual care, which is being a safe space to have difficult conversations about identity, meaning, loss, all of that kind of stuff, is something that we can all do. And it doesn't always feel comfortable. It can feel kind of uncomfortable and a little bit kind of daunting, but we need to be prepared for those conversations, because that's a lot of the time where our patients' heads are at.
Definitely.
So it is everybody's responsibility, but we do also have a spiritual care team. So what I always say to people when I'm doing training with nurses and that kind of stuff is, you have a responsibility to make sure that patients feel safe around you to ask those questions and explore those topics, but you don't need to have all of the answers. And actually, when something comes up where you feel out of your depth, that's where you call me. So our nurses aren't responsible for helping people plan funerals, for example, or even to take funerals. Our nurses aren't responsible for getting a patient baptized. We've had a couple of patients who wanted to be baptized. You know, you don't need to have that level of input, but you do need to be comfortable being asked about that and saying, well, let me talk to the spiritual care team. We'll get Tim or one of his volunteers to come and talk to you, and they'll chat to you.
So what do you think there's practical ways that staff can start these conversations, would you say?
I think like the best thing, which sounds easy, but actually it's really hard, is just to pause a little bit, to slow down a little bit. And it's hard because we're all so busy, but to introduce yourself to the patient and to ask them how they're doing, and to ask how their mood is on a day like today. You know, those kinds of things, just to open those conversational doors up. It doesn't have to be anything kind of super deep and meaningful, but just pausing for a minute to make a connection with the patient, you know, so you're not just going in and doing their personal care and then leaving. And to their credit, I think our nurses, both on the IPU and in the community, are brilliant at this. They do it already. You know, none of this is to say that they need to improve, because they already do it so well.
Absolutely.
And I certainly remember when I first started here after coming from the hospital, sitting in board round in the mornings and listening to the level of spiritual care which our nurses were already giving to our patients, and almost feeling a little bit like, well, what am I going to do?
Am I needed?
Yeah, because they do such a great job of it already.
Oh, that's fab.
So we do, I think, our team here at the hospice do an amazing job. And not just nurses. I think, you know, our cleaners, the pinkies, do a great job of it. They chat to patients. The catering staff, the volunteers, that, you know, they all do a really good job of it. But it's just, I guess, being aware that you're doing it, that when you're having those kinds of conversations, it's not just a nice chat, it's actually part of the spiritual care for our patients. It's we're fulfilling the nice guidelines,
Yeah,
we're doing what we're
absolutely.
supposed to do when we have those conversations. That's a part of our role.
Yeah.
And we should be proud of it.
Absolutely. So if we're all responsible for spiritual care, how do we get support?
Well, I mean, that's a really important question, because actually spiritual care is demanding, and empathy, which is a thing that makes us good at this job, comes with a cost. It's hard to be giving empathy all the time, because we connect with our patients, and their suffering and their illnesses and ultimately their deaths will naturally impact on us. And if we're opening the door to spiritual care, to those kinds of deeper, meaningful type conversations, that'll have an impact. And so I guess I would say, well, a couple of things. That the first thing is that for me, having my own spiritual discipline is really important. So, I mean, I don't need to massively go into detail of what my spiritual discipline is, because it'll be different for everybody. But
Sure.
for me, it's kind of, meditating, getting outside in nature, that kind of stuff. That's where I kind of recharge. And I would really encourage, and I know it's really hard because we're all busy, but I would encourage all of our staff to kind of ask themselves that question: what's my spiritual discipline? And it doesn't have to be anything that looks spiritual. It might be walking the dog twice a day.
Yeah.
It might be just, where is that place where you come home to yourself and you can completely relax and be yourself, and just make sure you nurture that, because that's what will give you the strength to kind of do this kind of work.
Yeah.
And then the other thing to say is that I and the spiritual care team are here for the staff as much as we are for the patients. And actually, in the last year or so, I've really noticed that there's a shift in terms of, I've spent quite a bit more time working with staff, kind of one-to-one, kind of reflective practice sessions, just informal chats in the corridor, that kind of thing. And that's been really great, because actually that's how we empower our staff to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
So if staff are listening to this and they're struggling at all with these kinds of things, with kind of spiritual care type issues, then I would say, come and talk to me. I'm around. And whether it's, a question about patient care, or whether it's something that you yourself are really struggling with out of work or inside of work, please come and talk to me. And it's a confidential space. I won't share anything that you tell me unless you ask me to share it. But if you don't ask me to, I'll keep it to myself. So do come and talk, because I think talking is really healing. And like I just said earlier on about patients, my job isn't to give answers. I won't be able to fix anybody's problems, but just having a safe space to listen and to offload, I think, is really important.
Massively
so
important.
By all means, do that.
Yeah, because you do tend to take it on.
Yeah.
I think as a practitioner.
Yeah. Yeah.
In practice, you do kind of almost take on people's feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, you do.
And
Yeah.
so being able to talk about it with someone, confidential, in a confidential, safe space, essentially, it's really beneficial.
I was talking about this with my volunteers just the other day, that like every time a patient dies, or every time a patient is suffering a little bit, there's a tiny little bereavement that we take on. Even if we weren't all that close to the patient, but we still feel that. And gradually those tiny little bereavements start to add up.
Absolutely.
And one morning you wake up and you're like, why am I tired? Like, why am I dreading going into work? And it's because probably you haven't even noticed that you're taking on all of these little bereavements, all these little griefs. And so finding, talking about it, externalizing it, is a really good thing to do. And it doesn't have to be to me, like I'm around, but like it can be to, a trusted loved one, a colleague, but talking about it is really important.
Yeah.
I met a chaplain probably about a year ago who told me they did this thing, which I really want to do myself, actually, because it sounded so powerful, where she became really aware of all of the other people's stories that she's carrying. And so she filled a rucksack up with stones, like little kind of, cobblestone type stones, and went for a walk with them. It was really heavy, but then got to a place in nature where she then emptied the rucksack and emptied all the stones out. And the idea was like, I'm leaving all of these other people's stories behind. I can't carry all of them. They're not mine to carry anymore. And then walked back with the empty rucksack, and obviously felt a million times lighter.
That's beautiful.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And you can do that like in quite a literal way, like she did, quite physically, but like talking, having your own spiritual practice, these are all ways of kind of emptying our rucksacks, you know, of getting rid of those stones, because they become heavy. So ask for help, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Fab. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me. It's been really fun.
Spiritual care isn't about fixing or having all the answers. It's about listening, being present, and honouring what matters most to the patient and family. It's about supporting the whole person.